Hey guys, this is my first time streaming, so let's hope everything goes well. I'm not sure how this is actually going to turn out, but today we're going to be looking at my photos from last night, the lunar eclipse. We actually had clear skies here in northeastern Ohio, and it was kind of a miracle. So I thought I'd walk you through all of my photos I took, and we'll also talk about how I took them, how to edit your photos if you managed to get any, and then some other tips for shooting at night. So these are all the photos I took last night. We can see I started pretty early, and the shadow moved pretty quickly across the moon. So with all that in mind, I'm just going to open up my photos here in Bridge and then Camera Raw, and we'll get a closer look here. So one of the things that kind of surprised me was just how bright the light here on the moon actually is. For example, if we look at an image like this here, you can see we got that really nice orange glow, but where the sunlight was hitting the moon, it's so bright, it just completely blows out any detail. You can see that it's just completely clipped there. So there's a huge difference in light between where the sunlight was reaching like normal and the dark area of the moon. That's why it did seem so bright last night before the eclipse began. So kind of cool there. But as it continued on, the view got more and more amazing if you didn't get a chance to see it. And then right around here, I think, is when the full eclipse actually began. So as you can see, they look pretty cool straight out of the camera. You don't have to do much editing if you have things set up right. And over on my settings, we can see I was using the Tamron 150 to 600. My shutter speed was 2.5 seconds, f6.3, which is as wide as the lens can go, and I was at ISO 100. And if we zoom in, it's fairly sharp. It could be sharper, but that's just because the atmosphere wasn't that great for this kind of work last night, but still, things came out really well. Now, the way I was actually able to take this photo was using a star tracker, so I'm going to show you that very quickly. Let's see, I'll pull this up here. And Star Tracker video is kind of dark, but this is going to move your camera and your lens at the same speed as the stars, or in this case, the moon. You can set different tracking speeds, and I guess it's pretty dark here, but what's going on is that the camera is attached, and it's just moving very slightly. So that allows me to keep the moon centered right in the frame without having to recompose every 2 or 3 minutes on just a standard tripod and ball head. So that's how that was working. And if you've never heard of Star Tracker before, this is kind of a photo I took out in the desert, but you can see it's pretty amazing just how well this works, because what's really going on is that the stars are always rotating overhead, at least as far as we see it, and the Star Tracker is going to rotate your camera just like the stars are moving. So you can capture, in this case, if you have a wide angle lens, up to 4 minutes or longer with sharp stars compared to 20 or 30 seconds. So anyway, this is what allowed me to shoot 2.5 seconds and up to 15 seconds last night of the lunar eclipse without any kind of motion blur. So if you didn't have a star tracker, frankly, I kind of forget how long you've been able to shoot without the moon moving, but probably not very long at all. So for future reference, if you want to get some amazing images, a star tracker will definitely help out. And I've got a bunch of tutorials on YouTube here if you want to learn more, or I've even got some full-length courses. So with all that out of the way, how I actually took the images, let's look at editing them. And it looks like this is one I already edited, so let's just put everything back to 0, and we'll see just what I have to do here. And actually, this one looks pretty good right out of the gate. So the first thing you'll notice when I put everything back to 0 is that it's kind of blue, right? That's because the auto white balance was set to 3150 Kelvin. And usually at night, you want to put it to daylight. That gives you more or less accurate night sky colors. So there's that really nice red. So that already really helped out the photo. And from here, it's really kind of up to you where you want to take the image. Personally, I try and maintain all the detail and the highlights and the shadows, and I would say it's pretty well done in this photo. So You could bring up the shadows if you want to. You can bring up the exposure. And you'll see when I bring up the exposure, the stars become more visible, but also this thermal noise, which is caused by the sensor heating up. And even though it was below zero last night and everything was getting covered in frost, the sensor was really heating up because I had live view on for probably 30 minutes straight. So that's what the purple noise you're seeing is, just heat from the sensor. But it's pretty remarkable what you can do with today's modern cameras. You can really bring out the shadows while retaining detail in the highlights. And I was actually using a Nikon D5600 yesterday, which is a crop sensor camera. Normally, I'm using my full frame D750, but I wanted a little bit more zoom. So that enabled me to make the moon look even larger. So that's how that all worked. But to be honest, not much editing is needed. Again, this is a straight raw photo, and it looks pretty good. Again, what I would try to do, just because you never see this, is you actually have the stars here that are visible. Because the moon was so dim, the stars were able to come through. Normally they're completely washed out. So if I bring up the exposure, so that way the stars are visible, now I can bring down the highlights to preserve that detail in the moon, just like that. Alternatively, what I could do is really crank up both the exposure and the highlights, and then I could take an adjustment brush, and this is kind of like doing your own manual HDR. But then from here, I can manually turn down the exposure and the highlights, and then just paint this in. So you can adjust your size down here, and just like that, I can preserve all of the detail there. And this isn't, compositing or anything like that. This is just using all of the data that's originally in the photo, just using some minor workarounds here to effectively turn on and turn off what you don't want. So I think that looks pretty good there. Again, we're using the adjustment brush, and this basically allows you to adjust the temperature or the contrast locally in one area, like that. And then from here, I can maybe bring up the whites a little bit more, and I think that looks pretty good right there. Now, to be honest, there's not really much I have to do in Photoshop, because when it comes to moon photography, it's kind of hard to do any real editing. Most of what I do is just here in Camera Raw. And another thing you'll always want to look at is the chromatic aberration. So this is caused by when you have contrast between light and dark. So if you just remove chromatic aberration, it automatically fixes that little green line right there. So that's something you always want to do, especially when you're photographing the moon. And then finally, one of the best ways to reduce noise, if you have noise, is using this luminance slider here. And I'm just going to increase this a little bit, usually 10 or 15, and that'll just lower the noise in your photo without losing too much detail. And all of you, if you're familiar with Lightroom, you should have available these tools in Lightroom, but I prefer using Camera Raw. I think it works a little bit better. But that was a 10-second photo. Again, I wouldn't have been able to do that without the star tracker, which was actually following the moon in real time, and it allowed me to shoot a longer exposure. But I also have some photos that I took down here. These were only 2 seconds, and I actually really like the way they look straight out of the camera. They're kind of dark and red and moody. But if I just bring up the exposure just a little bit so you can actually see the moon, and then I'll bring up the shadows a tad, I think that looks really cool. And one thing I've noticed is that the highlights usually have a massive impact on the brightness of the moon. So you do got to be careful when you're adjusting that one. You don't want to go too far in either direction. But as you can see, it doesn't take really any editing at all to get an amazing image, provided you have things right in camera. Again, this was another ISO 100 shot, 2-second exposure. It's 600 millimeters, technically about 900, since I was on a crop sensor camera, which really allowed me to make the moon look pretty big. And looks like I zoomed out some more and did the same thing. Here we can see that the moon's a bit too cold again, so I'm going to change the white balance from ash shot to daylight, and that looks a lot more natural there. I think the last thing we'll talk about is some basic edits in Photoshop. So I'm going to take this image here. This is probably one of my favorites. And one really important thing you want to do with edits like this, instead of just hitting open image, if you hold down the shift key, you can open this as a smart object. And this is going to be critical for, especially if you're editing nebula or Milky Way photos, because it's going to allow you to always go back to camera raw. So what I mean by that is, let's say you're editing your photo, doing whatever you want to do, and then you realize, you know what? The moon is just too bright. I don't like it, or the colors are weird. Since we open this as a smart object, all we have to do now is double click on the thumbnail, and it's instantly bringing us back to camera raw with all of our edits. So we still have the raw file intact. And from here I can adjust the white balance if I want to, maybe bring down the exposure a little bit, and then hit OK. Now it's going to apply those edits directly back to our smart objects. This is a really great way to maintain a high quality workflow. But like I said, there's really not much to do here in Photoshop. The only thing is that the detail there still isn't as sharp as I would like. Again, that's mainly due to the atmosphere more than anything. So an unsharp mask will probably help. And for that, I'm actually going to flatten this image right now. I'm going to hit rasterize layer, and then I'll hit Control, Shift, Alt, and E. Actually, since there's only one layer, I'm just going to right click it and duplicate the layer. Usually whenever you're doing sharpening or any kind of adjustments, you want to create another layer so you're not doing it to the base. And from here, I go up to Filter, Sharpen, and Unsharp Mask is a really great tool. So the way you're going to use this is adjusting the radius, so that way it brings out the details you want without going overboard. You know, if I go too far here, it's just looking kind of weird, and we're getting some odd banding around the moon itself. So you kind of just have to experiment what looks best for your own photo. Maybe somewhere right around here. And then you can just adjust the amount as needed. And that definitely really helped out. You can see a lot more detail on the moon. I think I went a bit overkill, but that's okay. And then just as a side note here, threshold, the way this slider works is if you put it to 255, it turns off the sharpening. 0 is the max amount. So this is kind of one way you can lower the effect if you want, but I'm just gonna leave it at 0, hit OK. And there's our before and after. It's subtle from back here, but when you zoom in, you definitely see a lot more of that detail there on the moon. But what I'm actually going to do in this case is turn it down just a little bit. So if I go to the opacity slider here, you can adjust this as needed. Maybe 50%. Then the last thing I like to do is that, as I mentioned before, it creates some weird fringing, especially right around the edges of the moon. So if I add a layer mask, you can see a white layer mask now. If you're not familiar with these, you definitely should become familiar with them. They're very crucial for photo editing. But if I take a black paintbrush and paint on my white layer mask, I can turn off this effect wherever I want it. See how the moon's kind of becoming muddy where I paint it in? So what I'm going to do now is just paint out the edges of the moon so I don't see that weird fringing. And you could be more or less precise here depending on what route you want to go down. Alternatively, I'm noticing there is some grain coming through in the sky when I did that sharpening, but it does make the stars look brighter. So let's say you only wanted to affect the moon rather than the whole sky. I'm just going to delete this layer mask and create a new one. Now, the best way to do that if you just want to affect the moon is hit Control or Command I. Now our white layer mask is completely black, which means I turned off the effect. So I'm going to take a white paintbrush now. I'm just going to paint in where I want that sharpening, just like that. So I can selectively target exactly where I need it. And you can do the same technique with a curves adjustment or some color effects, whatever you want to do, to just target a certain area in your photo using layer masks. This is stuff I'll cover a lot more in depth in any of my tutorial series. So if you want to learn more, you should check those out. Right now I've got one for deep space astrophotography, which is where we look at nebula and galaxies, how to take those photos, how to edit them. I've also got star tracker tutorials, which is more for wide angle shooting of the Milky Way and things like that. That's all over my website, but there we go. We see it's just a subtle sharpening on the moon. Nothing else is affected. And I'm pretty happy with that photo. That looks really nice. And as you saw, there was virtually no editing required. If we go back to camera raw here, all I really did was increase the exposure a little bit, I think. Yeah, I brought up the exposure. That's like just increasing the ISO in camera or taking a longer shutter speed. Brought up the highlights a little bit, the whites. And the big thing, like I said, that might help is if you use an adjustment brush, you can turn down some of those effects. That way you maintain detail and create your own HDR image without any of the weird artifacts. But I think that's about all I have for you guys today. Hope you enjoyed this first live video. I'm not sure how many more I'll be doing, but I figured with all the buzz about the lunar eclipse, you guys might enjoy this. So that's about all I have for you today. Again, if you want to learn more about astrophotography, you can head over to my website or even here on YouTube. I've got a lot of videos that'll help you get started if you're still new to it. So that's all I got for you. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in another video.